Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you are refreshed and that you've enjoyed some cake if you're here, or some of the refreshments you've had in your conference packs at home. We have got our second recorded talk from Hannah Malcolm on the title Climate Action. And again, she'll be joining on Zoom later for the panel. So if you have any questions for her, if you're in the room, the question post-it notes will remain on the welcome desk throughout the day. Just to make sure you label that they are for Hannah. Now, Hannah Malcolm is currently training for ordained ministry, and she's writing a PhD on theology and climate ecological grief. She regularly speaks about and organises around climate justice, and recently edited Words for a Dying World, Stories of Grief and Courage from the Global Church. So I'm going to hand over now to Hannah.
Well, welcome everyone to this session on climate action and science and faith. And I've entitled the discussion that I want to have with you today, Climate Action and the Church, Reforming Science and Faith in the UK. And so hopefully we can have some good conversation about some of the material that I'm going to share with you now, and what the implications might be for the relationship between science and faith when we think about climate action. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now and introduce some of the backgrounds to what I want to share. So about a year ago, I undertook some research with Caleb Gordon, aiming to analyse the growing participation of UK Christians in climate action over the last 5 years, and exploring the reasons for this. And in many cases, we found that climate science was cited as a necessary condition for the fulfilment of already existing Christian commitments. And this, we believe, represents a significant shift in the ways that UK Christians understand the role of dialogue between theology and the sciences. So I want to present some of that finding with you today. And I've also updated the participation data to reflect the changes of the last year as well. So first of all, some of the background to this. Well, the background to looking at climate action as something emerging particularly out of science-faith dialogue. One of the things that we're proposing is that previously, science and theology dialogue has usually been treated as an area of expert concern, primarily offering insight into apologetics or specific ethical problems. And by contrast, the dialogue between climate science and theology has seen the emergence of non-technical leadership amid the expectation that climate science plays a critical role in examining the meaning of Christian life, both for individuals and as communities. Christian communities and programs have seen a recent surge in climate initiatives, and I'm sure that's something that you're all aware of. And this surge is symptomatic of a shift in the relationship between science and Christian theology. So where the interface between the two disciplines has previously involved expert-led apologetics or specific moral problematizing, climate science is something new, a branch of science which forces a re-examination of all of life and thus necessitates a theological response from Christian communities. So we've therefore treated climate science as distinct from other areas of scientific inquiry which have influenced theology, both in the scope of its reach, that is, that it requires a response from non-experts, and the demands that it places on Christian communities, that discipleship is reimagined. And these trends within Christianity in the UK are not only about the pursuit of specific climate outcomes, but also represent a changing theological understanding of what it means to be Christian or to behave in Christian ways. And this is because Christians increasingly accept that the findings of climate science produce new parameters for the shape of moral life. And this position is being accepted before it is even explicitly or systematically understood. So Christians are, on the whole, not receiving climate science as experts, so they cannot respond as experts. They have to respond according to conscience, and rising participation in climate initiatives represents a reformation of Christian conscience according to popular understanding of climate science. So while this could be presented as a global phenomenon, the focus I'll offer here will be UK churches and an exploration of the science theology narratives at play. So first, I'll present some of the evidence for a shift among UK Christians, and then the relationship between climate science and theology will be compared to other areas of scientific inquiry. And I want to conclude by considering some of the narratives behind new attitudes to science theology dialogue and the reasons for their sudden and recent emergence. So drawing on data from Christian charities and organizations whose work directly involves the findings of climate science, the influence of science can be framed by noting how widespread and how demanding its role has become amongst non-technical actors, that is, those without higher level scientific or theological training in Christian communities. My focus on the last roughly 5 years is not meant to obscure the Christian institutions and individuals with a longer history of embracing climate science as a matter for transformative theological concern. And to name a few of them, the Anglican Consultative Council added its 5th mark of mission, that is, to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth in 1990, with explicit reference to understanding of the ecological crisis. The International Development Charity Tear Fund ran their first environment campaign in 1992 in order to raise awareness ahead of the Rio Earth Summit, and the John Ray Initiative was founded in 1997. But my focus on the last 5 years or so is specifically about the recent and widespread surge in public attention and concern about climate and ecological collapse, which coincides with increasing urgency from scientific reports and predictions, most notably following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2018 report, and also unprecedented response promises of global government cooperation, so the Paris Agreement in 2015. Nationally, we can also see that climate science communication has recently changed. In 2018, the BBC issued internal guidance on how to report climate change, clarifying that balance in debate did not require the presence of a climate denier. This institutional urgency has been mirrored in the church, with the papal encyclical Laudato Si marking a significant shift in the treatment of climate science as a key reference point for theology. And the growth of science theology dialogue in the UK church is particularly apparent in data evidencing the number of individual churches responding directly to climate science. And this is perhaps best represented in the Eco Church project launched by Arusha, a Christian environmental conservation and restoration charity, in 2016. As of now, over 4,000 churches, that's about 10% of worshipping communities in England and Wales, have registered for the scheme, with around 1,000 churches receiving awards. And that's an increase of about 2.5% in the last year. The project also offers regional networks of churches, that's dioceses, circuits, synods, and districts, awards for local collaboration. And as of this month, 43 Church of England dioceses have registered for the scheme, 13 of whom have already achieved bronze awards. The Eco Church project also demonstrates the extent to which the influence of climate and ecological science is treated as the basis for whole life discipleship. The rewards are assessed on the basis of engagement in worship and teaching, church building and land management, community and global engagement, and individual lifestyle. Resources provide support for churches who, quote, seek to become good news for God's earth, including guides to renewable energy sources, conserving local wildlife, reducing carbon footprints, and preaching prayer and worship. The range of initiatives and ideas reflects a new openness to information that has been available for some time. While the findings of climate science are not new, significantly more Christians are demonstrating a new willingness to engage with it as a serious source of guidance for Christian life. Local church engagement with climate science is also evidenced by the numbers switching to renewable energy suppliers. The 2016 Big Church Switch campaign encouraged churches to switch to renewable energy and led to the foundation of Church Buying, an organization which now has over 4,000 meters on 100% renewable electricity in its church group energy basket. The relation between the findings of science and the appropriate theological response is both explicitly named and treated as clear. So you can see the quote from the website here. By using green energy suppliers, you put faith into action and demonstrate commitment to tackling climate change, loving our neighbor, and caring for God's creation. So evidence for active faith assumes a direct relationship between existing theological tradition, love of neighbor, caring for God's creation, and the findings of climate science. Movement away from fossil fuels is another consistent theme. Operation Noah, a Christian charity campaigning about climate change, received commitments from 66 UK-based church institutions to divest from fossil fuel investments in 2019 and 2020. In spring 2021, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union of Great Britain, and the Church in Wales announced their divestment from fossil fuels, and the first Church of England diocese formally divested. Recently, the Church of Ireland and the Presbyterian Church in Ireland have divested. That's just in the last week or so. And there are now 4 Church of England dioceses who have made formal divestment announcements. Appeals to the institutional church to divest from fossil fuels and to introduce net zero targets have also gained sudden momentum. In February 2020, the Church of England's, let's remember, largely non-technically trained General Synod voted that the church should, quote, become carbon neutral by 2030. The success of this big church switch campaign, where churches have switched their energy suppliers, was also partly due to the influence of Christian international development charities who have taken a leading role on the relationship between climate change and Christian faith. So NGOs like Tearfund, Christian Aid, and CAFOD have played significant roles in shaping the relationship between science and theology in UK churches, particularly by framing climate science as a necessary resource for love of neighbour and justice for those living in poverty. As noted, Tearfund, whose mission statement is "Following Jesus where the need is greatest," began public campaigning about global political response to climate science in the 1990s. In 2015, they realigned their entire global policy and campaigning work around the concept of a, quote, restorative economy, maintaining that the world's current model of development risks becoming a victim of its own success via the unsustainable pressures it exerts on the planet. They were directed by the, quote, planetary boundaries defined by environmental scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they drew on the biblical principles of Jubilee and Sabbath for the Earth. Since then, environmental sustainability has become one of 3 corporate priorities for the charity. In 2019, over 130,000 people participated in Tearfund campaign actions. Christian Aid have similarly emphasised the need for a positive response to climate change, most notably in their campaigning. The Big Shift campaign has targeted major banks investing in fossil fuels under the following justification. Both the science and international agreements require banks to rapidly phase out finance to fossil fuels altogether in the coming years. To love our neighbours and God's abundant planet, as we're entrusted to do, requires a big shift in what banks are financing. So here you can see that science is made practically synonymous with the ethic of loving one's neighbour. Similarly, climate campaigning work by CAFOD draws on Pope Francis' interpretation of climate as a, quote, common good of our common home, to identify climate science as knowledge about neighbourly love. In 2017, 30,000 CAFOD supporters wrote to the UK's World Bank representative, Melanie Robinson, to call on the bank to bring renewable energy to people living without access to electricity. So there's a clear increase in willingness amongst Christians to refer directly to climate science as justification for their work, and also a shift in treating science as not only of general interest to Christian theology, but also requiring response from ordinary Christians. We might, for example, see the recent establishment of the Young Christian Climate Network and their pilgrimage to Glasgow as a powerful example. It is not just that climate science represents a new reference point for Christian ethics, but that it demands attention from every part of contemporary life. And the ethical demands of climate science are not limited to life within the church. Political protest groups like Christian Climate Action have also expanded exponentially, going from around 40 people on their mailing list in October 2018 to over 1,500 people in October 2021. The group's collaboration with Extinction Rebellion reflects a desire amongst Christians for theologically explicit participation in wider climate action. These examples not only represent a general societal shift, but a shift in how Christians understand their own theological integrity as increasingly tied to its incorporation and response to climate science. Now, these examples share an assumption that the findings of science should influence the life and witness of the church in the UK and beyond. And this isn't in itself new. Science has previously shaped Christian theology by, for example, changing our knowledge of what is true about the world, e.g. evolutionary biology, or shaping how Christians contextualize their faith, like technology, or in shaping the stances Christians take to present themselves as distinct from prevailing culture, like biomedical ethics. However, these categories provide insufficient descriptions for the emerging dialogue between climate science and theology. The following comparisons will demonstrate how the scope and impact of climate science differs from existing precedents in science-theology dialogue. So, changing knowledge about the nature of the world has a long history of influencing Christian approaches to other sources of truth, particularly scripture. One obvious example is interpreting the first chapters of Genesis in light of evolutionary biology. While explicitly allegorical interpretations of these passages are as old as the church itself, treating science and religion as compatible forms of knowledge, as, for example, the Church of England officially confirmed in 2010, has also required a shift in which interpretations of the texts are treated as theologically permissible. So a literal interpretation of Genesis runs counter to this approach and so must be abandoned, as indeed it has by the majority of Christians in the UK. But while evolutionary biology has had a direct influence on a particular area of Christian theology, its wider significance is limited. Scholars might debate the ways the theory of evolution affects the whole of Christian thought, so for example, the Faraday Institute, but there is little evidence to suggest that these implications are of wide-reaching concern to UK churches, beyond the role of apologetics in evangelism. The majority of work concerning evolutionary biology's dialogue with theology is led by experts who provide assurance for ordinary Christians that the findings of science do not threaten faith. So we might think of, for example, biologos. The theological impact of climate science can also be compared to other areas of scientific inquiry which have raised specific ethical questions for Christians. So stem cell research is one such example. It is an area of theological concern because it provides new territory for the application of Christian belief about the sanctity of life, rather than revealing something true of the world which had previously gone theologically unacknowledged. It also differs in the scope of Christian engagement. While there will be some Christians for whom it is of direct pertinence, for example, those working in biomedical sciences or who stand to benefit from the findings of stem cell research, its application to the Christian imagination is limited, in part by its practical relevance, and in part because it has largely been treated as a matter for personal conscience. The UK has some of the most permissive stem cell research regulations, and this has provoked little response from churches. Climate change is unique to the aforementioned science-religion debates for two primary reasons. First, its relationship to theology is one of mutual illumination. Climate science illuminates the kind of world we inhabit, and so it illuminates Christianity's context, while Christian theology illuminates the meaning of climate science. Christianity makes claims about whether the consequences of anthropogenic climate change are at odds or in line with God's will. This mutual illumination has not only shaped the responses of Christians. The use of theological language to describe this unprecedented threat is widely noted, both in public science communication and in the ways that climate action is framed, particularly in the widespread use of apocalyptic language, such as the rhetoric of Extinction Rebellion's leaders. Secondly, the findings of climate science are of universal concern. Public communication of climate science and theology demands a response from every person, whether or not they have received formal scientific or theological training. For some Christians, the response is, unfortunately, denial. Christians are obliged to treat climate science as not only changing assumptions of what is true about the world, but also dramatically recontextualizing faith and creating new parameters for Christian distinctiveness. For Christians who previously interpreted unlimited consumption and extraction as consistent with Christian practice, climate science has produced empirical evidence of bad theology. So, two questions emerge from this groundswell in Christian response to climate science. What narrative or narratives are reshaping the ways Christians in the UK imagine the relationship between science and theology? And why has this change to action happened now? Well, this changing sense of what it is to be Christian is not about changes in basic principles, but instead a re-examination of existing convictions in light of new contextual information. One could even say a new worldview emerges from the proliferation of climate science to which Christian belief is adapted. The repeated references to love of neighbor by those organizations facilitating Christian response suggests that this change is imagined as comparable to rounding a corner and finding someone in distress. We did not see it before, but now that we do, our faith requires response. Immediately, generously, before exhaustively analysing the situation or determining who holds what obligation. Christians in the UK recognise that climate science reveals harms perpetuated by the economic systems of the minority world, even if those harms are not interpreted or understood as direct, personal, or intentional incursions. Along with opportunities to provide direct assistance where possible, Christians find themselves compelled to divest from consumption and investment which furthers injustice. Now, a serious question follows this shift. What has prompted this suddenly surging interest and participation in climate action by UK Christians? The question is not simply a matter of sociological interest. Because it involves the reimagination of Christian living, the acceptance of climate science as a basic reference point for Christian activity is likewise a matter for theological reflection. The fact that these theologically framed trends follow decades-old scientific predictions and recommendations frames why now as a distinctively theological question in its own right. The science is not new, but the social context is. So a theological account of Christian action in relation to climate science must address not just the ways that the Christian faith and science can work together, but also account for the ways that experiences of life in the UK, our exposures to education, news media, theology, and personal experience seem to have created a tipping point among many UK Christians. As mentioned at the outset of this talk, positing a connection between misdirected values and ecological crisis is not new, nor is it a dormant biblical relic only recently uncovered. 50 years ago, John Cobb Jr. explored the relationship between climate science and Christianity in an essay entitled Christian Existence in a World of Limits. He characterizes the problem of climate change primarily as one of unmitigated consumption, making explicit the need for Christians to restore their relationships to other humans, the world, and God by adopting new limits on their behavior in line with increasing knowledge about the world and the consequences of global economic activities. For the past several decades, even as the alarms about climate change have been sounded, many Christians throughout the minority world were confronted with competing theological visions. On the one hand, the prerogative to use our own wealth to help less fortunate neighbours and to avoid accumulating wealth at the cost of the less fortunate, and on the other, a vision of a Christianized West, a global capitalism which signalled a new future in which affluence would be available to more people than ever. As Cobb noted, the latter vision proved a compelling yet insidious replacement to the former. Quote, when we thought that our own affluence contributed to the spread of affluence around the world, we could evade that teaching. In an age where the reality of increasingly violent and unpredictable climate events is ever less deniable, it becomes harder to maintain that vision of a future where the unmitigated pursuit of wealth will lead to a generally better world. After decades of being able to leave the science to the side, because its predictions were not yet ubiquitously evident, Christians in affluent countries are experiencing a reaction of conscience as well as personal experience. Cobb wrote these words half a century ago, but they require no modification for today. Perhaps for affluent Christians, the deepest level of response to the awareness of limits is the recognition that we cannot free ourselves from guilt. We are caught in a destructive system, and we find that even our will to refuse to identify with that system is mixed with the desire to enjoy its fruits. One of the things Christianity in the UK seems to be relearning from climate science, as well as the personally felt effects of the economic pressures and social norms which underlie the climate crisis, is that to be Christian cannot be restricted to individual or even local ethical concerns. It must be acted out. To be Christian is to be in the world in some way. Dissatisfaction with the current order is not inherently Christian, and nor is every form of protest. But if the way the world actually is must inform our Christianity, then this is a legitimate reason for Christians to reject the current order. Similarly, we should expect that the Christian imagination is capable of envisioning a different order based on Christian values, like truth and love for neighbour and love for God. So while much climate action aims at revising policies to ensure the planet's future viability, Christianity is also able to envision its own action in terms of restoring its relationship to God. Rowan Williams frames the contribution of science in terms of this relationship. Creation is itself an act of communication, a form of language. Creation is an address, an action that expresses an intelligence and asks for intelligent response. To penetrate the workings of the world, to understand its intelligible shape, is to come into contact with a divine action that is reasonable, consistent with itself, accessible in some limited ways to our minds. The processes by which the world's viability is now endangered are often, in some respects, scientific, in the sense that they are possible because of scientific breakthroughs. But an unwillingness to see these processes as part of an integrated whole, a unified creation and natural order, is at the same time a refusal of science, which became its own myth or its own narrative. Instead, the embrace of climate science by Christianity is, in a distinct sense, a correction wherever Christianity has previously embraced and interpreted itself through a false mythology. And so resistance to the climate-breaking global order is necessary for the reclamation of Christianity's identity and meaning. It is perhaps only secondary whether the activist surge among UK Christians was inspired by the heart or born of frustration and disillusionment. The dominant economic processes of the world are not compatible with the way the world really is, and both Christianity and climate science are allied in their efforts to provide a truthful account of the world as the basis of relationship to God. To decouple the Christian vision from the vision of global capitalism, of unlimited growth and consumption, is first to recognize that this vision is an illusion, and in this, climate science plays a critical role. People increasingly realize that it is an illusion, whether through the proliferation of popular climate science, through their own economic experience, or the acuity of their own insight and moral compass. So as Christianity decouples itself from the myth of infinite consumption in the UK, the question is increasingly asked, what is the Christian vision of the world and what action will it prompt? The surge in climate action in UK Christianity proclaims that climate science is required to answer that question, because climate science tells the truth about the world, and truth brings us closer to God. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward very much to our conversation with Ruth Valerio and to hear your questions later on.
I want to start by thanking Hannah for recording that for us. And I think it's a good point now to explain how our questions are going to work later on with those that have pre-recorded their talks. Technology has got some great advances, but one thing we've really struggled with this hybrid conference is to have everyone online and in person to do the panel. So our workaround for that is that the live speakers will be doing questions in here later on today. And those that have pre-recorded will be doing their questions on Zoom with the participants on Zoom. If you have any questions for those speakers, that's what we've got the questions out in the welcome room for. So if you have any questions, note them down on there and who they're for, and we will relay them to the online team. The same goes for anyone watching on Zoom. If you have any questions for the live speakers, we will put what we can to them then. Now, if the person you want to ask a question is not in the place where you are, you'll be pleased to know that all the recordings from today are being emailed out to everyone, whether you're in person or online. So you'll be able to see all the presentations again here from today. The link, I believe, has already been sent out, but I will be sending those out again. Okay, before we go to lunch, I am going to hand over to Ruth from Faraday. So again, Faraday is another close partner of ours, and Ruth wants to share some of the things that she is doing at the moment. Ruth.
Thank you, Steph. And yes, so hopefully most of you who have been members of Christians in Science for a while know who the Faraday is. I'll explain very briefly for those who don't. We are an academic research institute based in Cambridge. We do interdisciplinary research on science and religion, does what it says on the tin, and we also do some outreach to the general public. So events, courses, work with youth in schools, and in my case, actually supported by the whole Faraday team, work with churches, with adults in churches. So I'm going to tell you just 4 things that you can do to get in touch or get engaged with things that Faraday is doing, and these are things that people with a scientific background who are involved in churches might be particularly interested in. The first one is to check out our online resources on the Faraday Churches section. There are more than 500 pages there for you to look through. I would like to highlight the type, if you've got your glasses on or if you're online, there's a type filter there. So you can click in there and it will give you access to all the things that are for small groups, all the sermon starters and devotions, all the things that are related to different activities in the church. So you can navigate there before you consider reinventing any wheels by producing material specifically for your church, which may be a good thing to do, but do have a look. I do my best to review resources from lots of other organizations, and you should find things in there that are useful. There is a top 10 questions section that's just there on the left, and just direction is that? Anyway, that direction. Yes, left. And just below it, you'll see some light bulbs. That is the hot topics section, where there is a section on creation care. If you're looking to follow this up with your church, all the organizations mentioned so far are linked there with some highlights for resources that they've produced, as well as some other things that might be useful. So do go and explore. The other thing that we're doing is a course in January. We do it every year, 2-day introduction for church leaders. That includes the whole broad church leadership, home group leaders, student leaders, whatever. So if you are new to this field and you just want a starter in all the different topics, you might consider coming along, or you might consider tapping one or two people on the shoulder in your church, maybe the curate, maybe someone who's new to the church staff, or someone who might have some time to feed into some engagement with science and suggest that they come along. You might even give them the course as a gift. We'll be running it online as well as in person. So do have a look at that. The other thing I'd like to know is, can we help your church in particular? Can we help you, equip you to do things in your church? If you feel like you should be doing a thing and you haven't got round to it, maybe I can help you get started or equip you to do that without feeling like you're having to get off the ground all on your own. For example, we just ran a half-day training course for a local church last weekend and just went in and ran that for the minister, who wouldn't have had the chance to put that together himself. I'm particularly interested in chatting to you if you're involved in evangelical or a new charismatic or independent church. That's a particular area of focus for me at the moment. So do let me know. Keen to advise, keen to help, keen to recommend speakers and help you get things off the ground. I'm always wanting to help people realize that this is something they can do a little thing. In fact, it's probably better, a little bit like the response to the environmental challenge. Do a little thing, see if it works, try another little thing. If you try and do a massive event, it'll probably tire you out and you'll never ever want to do it ever again. So by all means, do the big events if you have some energy, but do let me help you do some little things. And speaking of little things, last but not least, if you're not on our newsletter list, it's a monthly newsletter. We will not spam you. Go, and I've got a QR code on the stand if you're here in person or online. Just go to the Faraday website. It's on the bottom right-hand corner of every single blessed page on the website, so you can't really miss the sign up. And you can keep in touch with what we're doing. So those are just a few things you can do to help us help you be active in your church. I know that CIS is also doing a church engagement scheme, and we're going to be working quite closely together on that. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope that what we do links in with helping you to respond to what you're hearing. Over to Steph and lunch.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, before we go to lunch, there are just a few notices that I would like to give The first one is about feedback from today. Now, on our rolling notices, both online and in person, there is a QR code that will take you to an online form. If you're environmentally minded and have the equipment to do so, we recommend that you use that to save paper. However, if you're here in person and are not able to access that, we do also have hard copies as well. We would love feedback from every single one of you. A lot of it is tick box. In fact, most of it is. So we just want to gauge some information about how you heard about today, and also what you think went well and anything that can be improved. The second thing is we've got some great resources and exhibits with us today. We've got our Christians in Science bookstall. I want to highlight that the books are free to take, but we would welcome any donations or contributions towards the cost of those books. We've got an honesty box, and we've also got a way that you can text the number that's on the stand, and it will use your phone billing to donate £1, £3, or £5. Maybe £10 in there? Mary's looking at me. Sorry, say again? Thank you. £3, £5, or £10. The books are free, but if you would like to donate, we would value those donations towards those books. And the final thing is lunch arrangements for those in person. I apologise for those attending online. We could only just about get refreshments to you. So I'm afraid you are going to have to sort your own lunch. We haven't quite got that virtual yet. But for those of you that are here in person, we are going to move into the Watney room through this door on the left. As you go through, you'll see all the tables set up. All the food for lunch is going to be on your table. And if you have any dietary requirements, there is food available for you on the table first on the left to collect to then take to your table. Can we also remind you, you probably don't need reminding after the last 18 months, but we've got hand sanitizer. So as you move through into eating today, please can you just remember to sanitize your hands as well. So for those online, we will see you in an hour for our annual members meeting. And in person, we will be back in this room as well to continue on with the rest of the conference. Thank you, and enjoy your lunch.
Jesus, keep